What is going on? My, you can't make this BS up followers. It's your host, Joel Davis. Before we start this story, I want you guys to understand the following. Due to the nature of this episode, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussion of domestic violence, child abuse, murder, assault, and animal cruelty. Consider this one and deciding how and when you want to listen. To get any help on domestic violence, again, visit spotify.com/resources. You have been warned. Tonight, we are going to talk about part 2 of The Contract Killer, Richard Kuklinski, a man who is responsible for 100 to 200 murders while working for the mob. We will talk about on this second part how he continuously do contracts, actually starts getting a little sloppy, and possibly start getting the attention of the federales or the federal, aka the FBI. With that being stated, y'all know what it is. Let's begin the broadcast. What's going on, everybody? Y'all know what it is. Your favorite host, Joel Davis, on You Can't Make This BS Up, is back. And I'm here. Appreciate y'all. So, first and foremost, I want you guys to know that I am enjoying doing this podcast. I am loving the followers I'm getting. I'm loving the people really paying attention to what we're doing on all platforms, all social media. Again, I want to thank you guys so much. If you got any suggestions on any story you want me to do a true crime, y'all know what to do. Get in the comment sections. You can get into my email that I personally have attached to this podcast. Just reach out to me and we will definitely do whatever we can to look into the case and do an episode like this. Now, we are on the second part of Richard Kuklinski. If you don't know who he is, Richard Kuklinski, or they would call him Big Rich, is known as being one of the most prolific contract killers the mafia has ever had in their arsenal. The thing about Richard is Richard was a very unique contract killer because, for one, he was a towering 6'5" to 6'6", based upon how he walked, and he was a little over 300 pounds. Now, the thing also about Richard Kuklinski is that he was able to always get his target. He never missed on an assignment. He was always on time and always came through. And he was so good at what he did is that even the mafiosos that hired him to do the work was also afraid of him because, again, he was good at what he do. But again, Richard was living two lives. He had the lives that he wanted people to see with his family and around his neighbors. And then it was the criminal underworld, where he was known as a man that was not to be messed with. On this second episode, we're going to talk about some of the things he did and how his infamy caught up with it. So again, this is the second part of Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman. Let's get it. Richard was staking out a hotel in Queens, working a job for the Cavante family. He was having trouble keeping track of his mark. There was someone else who distracted him. From his shifty eyes, long and wild hair, and careful movements, Richard immediately recognized this man as a contract. The way he kept popping up, Richard's first thought was that he's also been assigned to kill the same mark. But then he started to wonder if the other man had actually been sent out to kill him. After several days of staking out the hotel, Richard was sitting in his van, tranquilizer gun at the ready, when he heard the jingle of an ice cream truck approaching. It was a hot day, and he was getting thirsty, so he flagged down the Mr. Softy truck as it drove by. Sure enough, there in the driver's seat was that guy. By that point, Richard and the Mr. Softy driver had both clocked each other as killers. Richard asked him what he was doing, and the man told him he used the ice cream truck to do surveillance. The truck wasn't just a front, it was a fully stocked in operation. The man gave Richard a soda, and they got to talk. His name was Robert Prongay. He was former military, and his main interest, even after leaving the army, were explosives and murder. It was as if fate had brought them together. Richard took a break from his stakeout and went back with Prongay to check out his garage. Tucked in the back corner was a locker filled with guns, ammunition, poison, and remote detonator grenades. He showed Richard his favorite weapon, a white spray bottle full of cyanide mixed with dimethyl. As Prongay explained, it's the concoction was sprayed onto someone's skin. It would absorb and kill them within seconds. He demonstrated on a stray cat passing by. One spray in the face and the cat instantly killed over. It was the quickest, cleanest murder method Richard had ever seen. And Richard and Prongay became fast friends. They shared murder tips and tricks and even started doing jobs together, splitting the payment. On one occasion, they needed to make it look like a man died much later than he actually did. They brainstormed and came up with an idea. If you freeze a body, it won't decompose. They stored the body in a meat freezer, and when they took the body out months later, it appears as if he'd been dead for a few days. The police never figured out the man had actually been dead for several months. By 1980, it seemed like Richard was hitting his prime. He had a wonderful family, his career was on the way up, and he even made a couple of good friends, or so he thought. Over the next few years, Richard would discover that only good friend is a dead friend. Now keep that in mind. This is what Richard said. The only good friend is a dead friend. Lord have mercy, man. That's hard right there. It was a hot summer day in 1986. Detectives Patrick Kane and Ernest Volkman were sitting on the couch in Richard Kuklinski's living room. Richard offered the detectives iced tea, and they both declined for fear they would be poisoned. He sat down in the easy chair across from them, right below a giant oil painting of himself and his wife, Barbara. His eyes were hidden under dark sunglasses. Detective Kane told him they were investigating a number of murders. Louis Masgay, George Malabon, Paul Hoffman, Danny Deppner, and Gary Smith. Richard coolly denied knowing any of these people. Then Kane asked, did he know a Robert Prongay or Roy DeMeo? Richard stared at him for a long moment and then said, sure, I know DeMeo. You guys know I knew him. Why don't you like me, Mr. Kane? Kane replied, who said I don't like you? Richard answered, I can see that in your eyes. Kane insisted he didn't take his work personally, but it was a waste of breath. By the time he and Volkman had gotten back into their car, Richard had made up his mind he was going to kill Detective Pat Kane. Woo! I'm telling you, this is how it is. Now we're doing a recap. Remember, Richard Kuklinski's criminal career began in 1949 when he was 13 years old, and he beat the neighborhood bully to death and allegedly threw him over a cliff. Then, for the next few decades, he made a living through hijacking, piracy, pornography distribution until the mid-70s. And then, under the guidance of mafia executioner Roy DeMeo, he learned to channel his aggression in a more profitable direction as a contract killer. Through it all, he flew completely under the radar of law enforcement. Because seeing his neighbors in his suburban neighborhood of New Jersey, everybody thought he was a friendly family man. real tall, dad-like guy who was successful in a film production business that they didn't really know what kind of film it was. Even his own family didn't know what kind of film he did, which we already know that later they come to realize it was smut, aka pornography. And because he kept his crimes and his personal life completely separate, he never been linked back to any of the 100 or more murders that he has committed by contract or just for fun. But in 1980, Richard broke his own cardinal rule though. He killed someone who he could be tied back to his old friend, George Malaban. Georgie Boy, as Richard called him, was a sweet man and a longtime family friend, but his obsessive gambling had gotten him into trouble. Because he owed a lot of money to a lot of, including Roy DeMille. Richard did what he could to smooth things over between them, but he could only do so much. When George's final notice came in early February of 1980, he made a desperate visit to Richard. They were driving along in Richard's van when George made a fatal mistake. He told Richard, "I don't think you'd ever let DeMayo hurt me. I know where you live, where your family lives," and threats against his family were one thing Richard couldn't abide by. He immediately pulled over, grabbed his pistol, and shot Georgie Boy 5 times. Richard disposed the body the same way he usually did. He stuffed him into a filled barrel drum and threw him into the reservoir. But he didn't stick around to see that drum hit a rock on the way down, causing the lid to bust open. The body was found and identified just days later. Richard was actually questioned about George Malaban's murder. George had apparently told his brother that he was going to meet Richard on the day he was last seen alive, but Richard told the police he didn't know anything, and since he's never been connected to a homicide case before, the matter was dropped. This brush with law enforcement should have been a warning. He needed to be more careful and keep a circle of associates as small as possible. But the truth was, Malaban gone, Richard was only longing for more friends. He was perpetually shut out of the mafia since he wasn't Italian. He wanted to be part of something, to have his own crime family instead of always being the lone wolf. So around 1981, Richard rounded up a few guys he met at Phil Soleimani's store and organized them into a little breaking and entering group. The second in command of the group was Percy House, Phil Soleimani's brother-in-law. Then there was Danny Deppner, a perpetually unkept man whose wife had recently left him to shack up with Percy. There was Al Rink, a scrawny little guy, and Gary Smith, a tall, bespectacled man with a beard that made him look like Abe Lincoln. They were hardly America's most wanted, but they could follow Richard's order. Throughout 1981, they broke into dozens of houses around New Jersey, stealing valuables and selling them at Bill's store. Meanwhile, Richard and Phil were running their old side scheme of luring customers into the store for phony sales and killing them and taking their cash. Since the entire setup was predicated on buying stolen goods, the victims didn't tell anyone where they were going before they disappeared, so the murders were never linked back to Phil and Richard. This is until one day in July 1981 when their mark, Louis Mass, mentioned that he told his family he was heading out to Phil's store. If he disappeared that night, Phil would be the first one questioned. Fortunately, Richard stormed in and shot Mass in the head before Phil had a chance to pass along that information. Thinking on his feet, Richard decided to pull out the old trick he'd done once before. He and Phil lowered Maskey's body into an old well full of cold water, hoping the body would freeze well enough to throw off the time of death. Whenever they decided to take the body out, it would look like Masqué had died long after his visit to Phil's store. But a few weeks later, Phil got into an argument with Percy House, foreman of Richard's breaking and entering crew. He offhandedly threatened him by mentioning that Richard had killed Louis Masquet and George Malaban too. The cat was out the bag now. Percy told the rest of the gang, who told their wives, who told their friends, and eventually everybody knew. Richard didn't like having his name directly linked to two of his murders. The only hope that is, as long as his crew stayed out of trouble, there'll be no reason for anyone to rat him out. That hope was misplaced. In late 1981, Patrick Kane was called into the supervisor office to meet a burglar. One Al Rink had just been caught breaking into a house and was ready to cut a deal for a lighter sentence. Rink claimed his gang was responsible for dozens of unsolved burglaries across the state. No one could tell whether he was being honest, so Detective Kane was asked was driving Rink all around New Jersey for 2 days as he pointed out every single house the gang had robbed over the past year. Rink also named his accomplices Perry House, Danny Depp, Gary Smith, and one man he knew only as Big Rich. Kane said to work across referencing Rink's testimony with their map of reported burglaries. It would take some time to put together an indictment, but it all seemed straightforward. There was only one missing piece of the puzzle. Who was Big Rich? Big Rich was, by early 1982, too busy to pay much thought to Al Rink. He was still doing contract work for the mafia with his pal, Robert Prong, a.k.a. Mr. Softy. He was making frequent trips to L.A., where his porn distribution business now had a West Coast headquarters, and his oldest daughter, Merrick, was about to graduate high school. Rich had always tried to make time for his family. He went to all his son Dwayne's middle school wrestling matches, the one activity the two could bond over. Father-son bonding was a foreign concept to Richard. He tried his best to reach out, but Dwayne had never really taken to the BB guns, swords, and knives Richard gifted him with. For the rest of the Kuklinski family, Richard's good moves were still overshadowed by his violent rages. He beat Barbara mercilessly and thought he never laid a finger on the children. Just witnessing his outbursts terrified. Recently, Barbara and their teenage daughter, Chris, had hatched a plan to poison him. The only way to get him out of their lives for good. They were too scared to ever go with it. So Richard remained completely oblivious to exactly how much his own family hated it. He often dreamed of saving enough money to get out of the business before it was too late. He knew no one made it out of his line of work except in handcuffs or in a casket. He only hoped he would never be arrested in front of his family. He couldn't stand to see the humiliation in judgment. But retirement was a far off dream. Richard still had places to go and people to kill. In April of 1982, Richard began having problems with his cyanide supply. Paul Hoffman. Hoffman didn't do anything specifically wrong. Richard just thought he was greedy and annoying as usual. Richard saw the problem by luring Hoffman to his warehouse for a phony business deal, leading him to a death with a tire iron and stealing $25,000 in cash that he had brought along with it. He left Hoffman's body in a steel barrel outside a nearby diner, hidden in plain sight. Thought he was in the clear until the police came around. Apparently on that day, Hoffman disappeared. He had a friend that he was supposed to see, Richard Kuklinski. Richard kept cool. He told investigators he didn't even know Paul Hoffman. They must have the wrong guy. These detectives were from a different precinct than the ones who investigated George Malaban's murder 2 years earlier. So they had no clue Richard had been spotted and been questioned in that previous case. They let him go. But Richard's real problems was just beginning. By October 1982, Detective Kane had a 152 count indictment against New Jersey burglary crew Percy House, Danny Deppner, and Gary Smith. The elusive leader, Big Rich, remained to be seen. On December 17, 1982, the police swooped in and made their first arrest, Percy House. But when they moved to apprehend the rest of the gang, they were nowhere to be found. Danny Deppner and Gary Smith had suddenly vanished. Unbeknownst to the police, when Richard got wind that Percy had been arrested, he immediately took Danny and Gary to the New York motel in North Bergen, New Jersey. He thought he could trust Percy to keep his mouth shut, but he wasn't. Now, Danny Deppner and Gary Smith had suddenly vanished. Unbeknownst to the police, when Richard got wind that Percy had been arrested, he immediately took Danny and Gary to the York Motel in North Bergen, New Jersey. So let me rephrase that again. Unbeknownst to the police, when Richard got wind that Percy had been arrested, he immediately took Danny and Gary to the York Motel in North Bergen, New Jersey. He thought he could trust Percy to keep his mouth shut, but he wasn't taking any chances with all three of them behind bars. Richard told Danny and Gary very calmly to stay in the motel room and not to leave under any circumstances. They were terrified of Richard even more than they were scared of going to prison, so they didn't argue. But it was a week before Christmas and they had families at home. And after days of holding up in the smallest room, they were getting restless. On December 20th, Gary Smith snuck out the hotel and hitchhiked back home to see his 5-year-old daughter. He made it there and back to the hotel without running into the police. A few days later, on Christmas Eve, Richard came to visit bearing burgers and fries from a nearby diner. He passed out the burger, 2 with pickles for himself and Danny, and 1 without for Gary. He was in a great mood, full of holiday spirit, despised the circumstance. It was an almost jovial meal. 3 friends sticking together through thick and thin. What better way to spend Christmas Eve? And about halfway into his burger, Gary suddenly fell over in spasms, his face turning blue. Richard had found out somehow about Gary's voyage home. He laced his hamburger with cyanide. Richard watched stone face as Gary choked in spasms, but he did die. Impatient, Richard pulled a wire out of the bedside lamp and told Danny to strangle him with it. And Danny did what he was told. When Gary finally stopped breathing, they stowed his body under the mattress. Richard would later admit this was a bad idea, but at the time, if his body out of the room and left view. But either way, it didn't matter. If the body was found, Danny was the only person who could link Gary's death to Richard. And Danny wouldn't be around much long. After Richard Kuklinski and his associates, Gary Smith, on Christmas Eve of 1982, he went back home to enjoy the rest of the holidays with his family. He trusted Danny Deppner to keep quiet. After all, Danny had participated in Gary's murder. He couldn't possibly be dumb enough to talk about a murder he himself had committed. On 4 days later, on December 20th, Gary's rotting body was found on a mattress at the York Motel. The once thin, pale-skinned Gary was bloated and decomposed. That police identified the body as an overweight black male. They had no leads. Until a few days later, on January 3rd, when Barbara Deppner, Danny's ex-wife, arrived at the detective Pat Crane's. So a few days later, on January 3rd, when Barbara Deppner, Danny's ex-wife, arrived at Detective Pat Kane's office, Danny had called and told her what happened to Gary. She was in a panic, pleading with Kane to stop. Richard Kuklinski. So Danny had called and told her what happened to Gary. She was in a panic, pleading with Kane to stop. Richard Kuklinski before he did the same to Danny. She kept calling Richard the devil, a killer, a professional killer. Kane was quick to put it together. This must be the elusive Big Rich. Kane searched through the state records and quickly found Richard. So Kane was quick to put it together. This must be the elusive Big Rich. Kane searched through the state records and quickly found this Richard Kuklinski. He lived in Dumont, just a couple of towns over. With his wife and 3 kids. He had on 2 separate occasions punched through car windows in road rage incidents, and he was all once briefly bought in writing a bad check. But that was nothing on the record to Richard. Let me see. Again, the next week, Richard found out Danny had told his ex-wife what happened. He promptly killed him, wrapped his body in trash bags, and dumped him into the reservoir. He didn't bother to hide the body very well. Richard was getting old and was getting tired. He didn't have it in him to dismember and bury corpses the way he used to. And with Gary and Danny dead, Richard thought he was safe as long as Percy didn't turn on him. It was now early January 1993, and Percy has been in jail for a month, all the whole while being pressed for information by Detective Kane. Kane told him he wanted to see what. And when Gary and Danny was dead, Richard thought he was safe as long as Percy didn't turn up. Now we're looking at early January 1980, and Percy had been in jail for a month, all the whole while being pressed for information by Detective Kane. Now Kane told him all he wanted was Richard Kuklinski, and if he gave him Kuklinski, Kane would cut on Percy a nice deal. Plea deal, I meant. Percy quickly figured out that Richard killed Gary and Danny, and he didn't want to go out the same way. But with every day he spent behind bars, the prospect of plea deal became more tempting. Eventually, he decided he'd rather take the chances on the street than spend another night in jail. Percy truly didn't know anything about Gary and Danny's murder, but every day he spent behind bars, the prospect of plea deal, like I said, became more tempting. And Percy truly didn't know anything about Gary and Danny's murder, but he did tell Kane about the 3 other murders. He heard that Richard was responsible for George Malaban and Louis Mast and Paul Hoffman. Kane ended up the more other precincts, and realized that Richard had been questioned in all 3 cases. But each time he told police he didn't even know the victim, and with no hard evidence to the contrary. Since the murders and disappearances all happened in different jurisdictions, no one had linked them together. But Malaban, Moss, and Hoffman all had one thing in common with Gary Smith and Danny Death. They all spent their last days with Richard Kuklinski. The only thing missing was physical evidence. On May 14, 1983, 4 months after his death, Danny Deppner's body was finally found. Since the murder and disappearance all happened in different... Okay. So again, like I said, Daddy Deppner's body was finally found near the West Milford Reservoir, and he still had his wallet in his pocket, and he was quickly identified to Detective Kane. The prime suspect was obvious, Richard Kuklinski, but with no evidence except Barbara Deppner's. No skirt to go with that. That's crazy. So the prime suspect was obvious, again, Richard Kuklinski, but with no arrest except Barbara Deppner's accusation, he couldn't make an arrest. A few months later, in September 1983, So a few months later, in September 1983, Richard decided it was finally time to get rid of Louis' frozen body. The trick worked. When he pulled Matt's body from the well, it looked like he'd been passed away for a day or so. So it actually worked too well, because the body was just a few days later before it had time to fully defrost. And then the autopsy revealed that Musquet's organs were filled with ice. The investigator easily picked together what had happened. Mass must have been killed shortly after his disappearance, then frozen to throw off the time of death. Suspicion fell back on the last man that was seen with him. And it was the same man that Percy House had accused of murder, Richard Kuklinski. Kane put together everything he could find on Richard and his alleged victims and brought it to the NYPD Organized Crime Division, hoping they could help find some missing links. The NYPD gave Richard mugshot to a mafia informant who recognized the man in the photo as the Pulp, a hitman who worked with Roy DeMeo. Maybe there was something to Barbara Depner's claim that Richard was a professional killer. It was early 1984, more than 2 years after Richard first came to Kane's attention. The pieces were finally falling into place. But aside from all the rumors, there were no actual proof that Richard had committed any crimes at all. Richard was definitely getting sloppy, but he was too careful to leave physical evidence linking him to his crimes. The only way to catch him would be getting someone close to him, someone he trusted. But there were precious few people Richard trusted, and nearly all of them were already dead. But unbeknownst to the police, Richard already planning to tie the last loose ends. Robert Progney, the Mr. Softy truck driver from hell, was always been a little off. But lately he's been acting completely senseless. He had even asked Richard to kill his ex-wife and son, an innocent woman and child. If they weren't friends, Richard would have killed him on the spot for even asking. Then in 1984, Progney pitched the idea of poisoning an entire town's water supply for the sake of killing one family he'd been given a contract to murder. That was the last straw for Richard Progney needed to go. So in early August of 1984, Progney was in the garage cleaning up inside his ice cream truck. He didn't hear Richard sneaking in. He barely had time to react before Richard shot him. A few days later, the police found Progney hanging out of the driver's side door for his ice cream truck with the 2 bullets in his chest. They had no leads on who might have done it. In the end, it wasn't Progney Richard needed to worry about. His downfall would be at the hands of the only friend he never killed, Phil Salamini. See, in early 1985, a new customer began hanging around Phil's store, Don Provenzano, an old friend of Phil's who traded in weapons. In reality, his name was Dominique Polifini, and he was an undercover EFT agent. See, Dominique had infiltrated so many mob circles over the years that he was indistinguishably from a real gangster, even when he wasn't on the job. When Detective Kane told him about Richard Kuklinski's suspected crime, Dom lost his temper and sensed that a murderer was still walking the streets. Kane knew Phil Salome was one of the few people Richard trusted, and Phil, it turned out, was more afraid of going to jail than he was of Richard Kuklinski. So when Detective Kane and Dominique showed up at his store, it wasn't too hard to twist the arm helping him out. When Detective Kane and Dominique showed up at this store, it wasn't hard to twist his arm into helping him out. At Kane's instructions, Phil called Richard and told him his old buddy Dom was in town, and if he needed any weapons, he should stop by. The plan was for Dom to hang around the store, ingratiating himself with the regulars, so that when Richard eventually showed up, he would look like a trustworthy guy. And Dom hung around all day playing cards, chatting up with the local criminal. But Richard never showed. Days passed and weeks. Phil called Richard a few more times, but he didn't answer. Kane started to wonder if they blew their cover already. They didn't know that Richard wasn't even in the country. He recently been recruited into an international money laundering scheme, and he was on a trip to Switzerland to pick up a check. Richard's job was to pick up checks in Zurich, Switzerland, fly back to America, and cash them in. And Richard's job was to pick up, like I said, the checks in Zurich, Switzerland, fly back to America, and cash them in a bank account he set up in Georgia for his trouble. Now, he got 25% of each six-figure check. And over the next few months, Richard popped by Phil's store a few times between his trips to Switzerland. But it was always at the rare moment when Dom wasn't there. And it went on like that for over a year with no progress. And then in the summer of 1986, Detective Kane decided they have to kick the hornet's nest. Richard just got home from another trip to Zurich when he received a visit from Detective Kane and another detective, Ernest Volk. They asked him if he knew anything about the murders of Louise Mass, George Malaban, Paul Hoffman, Danny Dappner, Gary Smith, Robert Prongay, or Roy DeMario, who he accidentally had misspelled a few years ago. Richard flatly denied even knowing the first six people. He conceded that he knew DeMaio. He didn't know anything about his murder. Kane mentioned that they had phone records proving Richard had called the York Motel in the days before Gary Smith's body was found there. Richard said he didn't know anything about that. He got up and led them to the door. The discussion was over. Detective Kane had shown up and asked vague questions about making an arrest, and Richard assumed it meant he didn't have any real evidence. Then if Richard killed Kane, maybe the whole thing would just go away. But if Kane turned up dead, Richard would obviously be the first suspect. It had to look like he died of natural causes. And that's when he decided he needs cyanide. Richard had killed his two cyanide resources, Paul Hoffman and Robert Prongay, and he was having trouble finding another supplier. So on a whim, he called Phil Salamini and asked if his buddy Dom, and on the morning of September 2nd in 1986, undercover ATF agent Dominique Polifone finally met Richard Kuklinski at Dunkin' Donuts near Salamini's store. Richard got right to the point. He wanted cyanide. Dom said he could do that. Richard was finally on the hook. The problem was buying and selling cyanide wasn't illegal. He had to bait Richard into doing something else, something incovertly criminal. Thinking on his feet, he told Richard he had a friend in the IRA who was looking to buy some heavier weaponry in return for the cyanide. Could Richard help with that? Richard said, sure, let me make a few calls. They traded phone numbers and parted ways. Richard had no reason to suspect Dom was up to anything. Phil had vouched for him and said he'd known Phil for 20 years. But his arms deal sounded like an unnecessary hassle. It might be easier to just kill Dom and his RA friend and take both the cyanide in their cash. Meanwhile, Dom Kane in the state's Deputy Attorney General Bob Carroll put together a task force for their new number one priority, Operation Iceman. Even though Louis Mass was the only victim of Richard who was ever found frozen, the name stuck. After all, Richard was undeniably cold as ice. And over the next few weeks, Don worked to hammer out the details of the phony arms deal with Richard. He even spoke to Richard Armsdale on the phone. It looked like it was all coming together. Little did they know Richard was actually scamming them. The arms dealer he introduced Dom to was actually an associate of his from the money laundering business. There would be no weapons. When Dom showed up with the cyanide, they were going to kill him on the spot. Dom's supervisors told him he could not, under any circumstances, give cyanide to a serial killer. But Richard wasn't letting up. So they devised a new plan to use the situation to their advantage. They give Richard fake cyanide and lure him into trying to commit a murder with it. The way they'll get him for attempted murder in addition to illegal firearm sales, Dom pitched the idea to Richard. He wanted to use cyanide to poison a client of his who became a pain to deal with, a young, rich cocaine addict. Dom had never used cyanide before, so he wanted Richard's help. They lured the client to a bogus cocaine cell, poisoned him with a cyanide-laced egg sandwich, and then split the cash the kid had bought. Richard had no problem with this. The egg sandwich seemed a little bizarre, but the whole plan eventually simplified things for him. Instead of waiting around for his arms deal to materialize, he could just kill Dom at the same time they killed the cocaine buyer and all the cash themselves. Told Dom he was all in, but over a year and a half into the sting operation, the police was finally closing in. But the day of the big arrest wouldn't go as they expected, because on the morning of December 17th, 1986, the New Jersey police, ATF, and FBI surrounded a rest stop at the New Jersey Turnpike. Armed and ready, Detective King was there walking from a dark van in tinted windows. He'd been waiting for this day for years. He's given assurance that he could personally be the one to put the cuffs on Richard. But when Richard arrived at the turnpike, he was already waiting with a white paper bag of egg sandwiches. He passed it to Richard along with a small vial of white powder. Dom said loud and clear into his hidden microphone, "Here's the cyanide." He then clarified that it was enough cyanide to kill a lot of people. Richard didn't notice. He was too focused on the black van with the tinted windows parked across the lot. Richard walked straight towards the van, Dom trailing after him. Inside, Kane and the other detectives ducked down, careful not to make a move. Richard squinted into all the van windows, but couldn't see anything. He let it go. Told Dom he was going to get his van, which was parked at his nearby warehouse as they planned. Dom would go pick up the cocaine buyer and meet Robert back at the turnpike in a half an hour. Richard drove a bit down the road and pulled over and stopped to take a look at the cyanide. A closer look at that. It didn't look quite right. He opened the vial and took a very careful whiff. It didn't smell right either. He got out the car and fed a taste of the powder to a stray dog on the side of the road. The dog waddled off wagging his tail, completely fine. This wasn't cyanide. Dom had scammed him. Richard didn't know exactly what Don's game was, but he didn't feel like sticking around to find out. He drove to a phone booth, called Barbara, and asked her if she wanted to go out for breakfast. While the strike force kept their eyes locked on the empty turnpike parking lot, Richard drove back to Dumont, stopped to pick up some groceries, and went home. Luckily for the police force, they assigned 2 detectives to circle around Richard's neighborhood, keeping an eye out. And when they looked around 10, they were surprised to see Richard in his driveway carrying groceries instead of the turnpike, where the sting was supposed to be going down. They called the strike force with the news. All at once, 15 unmarked law enforcement vehicles streaked out of the rest stop parking lot, speeding over the Dumont, sirens wailed. They weren't going to catch Richard poisoning a man red-handed, but they didn't have enough to arrest him for conspiracy to commit murder. Back home, Richard took his time putting away the groceries while Barbara got dressed. Despite the strange morning, Richard was in a pretty good mood. Barbara was feeling a little under the weather, and Richard insisted he take her to the doctor. Away after that, went out for some bacon and eggs. He helped her zip up her jacket and opened the door for her as they headed outside. As they started down the block and made their way down the street, Richard noticed the long line of cars gathered at the end of the road. Strange, but didn't think nothing of it. until the vehicle surged forward in unison. Richard swerved, running the curve. A swarm of police and federal agents jumped out and surrounded Richard's car. One of them jumped onto the hood of the car, pointing a gun right at Richard through the windshield. Detective Kane ripped open the driver's side door and pulled Richard out. 8 strike team members piled on top of him, subduing him while Kane tried to wrestle cuffs onto his massive wrists. The deputy police chief grabbed Barbara and pushed her to the ground, keeping a boot on her back while he cuffed her. This threw Richard into a rage. He would have gone quietly, but they had no right to hurt Barbara. It took the force of 4 men to slam Richard onto the hood of the car and wrestle his arms behind his back. His wrists were too thick for the handcuffs. Detective Kane had to shackle his arms together with leg irons. The whole time, Richard kept struggling and screaming. There's no reason to involve her. She's innocent. But Richard knew it was over. He always wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, shootout. He'd rather die than live to see the shame and embarrassment his family would face once his crimes were exposed. But it was just too late for that. His wife and children were about to find out who he really was. It didn't matter what happened at the trial, whether he was given life in prison or the death penalty. Humiliating his family was already a fate worse than death. December 1886, Richard Kuklinski was officially charged with 16 counts of his crimes, including weapons charges, robbery, attempted murder, and the murders of Gary Smith, Danny Dappner, Louis Moss, George Malaban, and Paul Hoffman. When Barbara heard the list of charges against her husband, she was shocked. She knew Richard was violent, but she had no idea how violent. For a while, she thought he was being framed for the whole thing. But as she sat in the courtroom listening to Richard freely discuss murder on the tapes Don Polyphone had recorded, she slowly realized exactly who she'd been married to for the past 25 years. The Kuklinski children, on the other hand, were not surprised at all. They always suspected their father capable of murder. Merrick had gotten married and had a baby while Richard was in jail awaiting trial. She came to the trial with her baby in her arms on Richard's attorney advice that it might make the jury more sympathetic. But Richard knew he didn't have a chance. He told his lawyers not to bother putting up a defense. He just wanted it all to be over as quickly as possible. After 4 weeks of testimony, the jury found Richard guilty on all accounts. He would spend the rest of his life in a cell at Trenton State Prison. After years of killing at the behest of the mob, the murders that finally got Richard locked up were the ones he committed on his own initiative. If he hadn't begun killing people he had a personal connection to, it's possible he never would have been caught. His sloppiness, his careless mistakes ultimately led to his downfall. And in the years after his arrest, Richard adjusted surprisingly well to prison. Kept a positive attitude because if he let prison break his spirit, that means the police had won. He was given medication for depression and anxiety, which finally helped him bring his miracle temper under control. He and Barbara divorced, but he still wore her letters, wrote her letters almost every day. She rarely responded. Outside the prison walls, the prolific hitman, dubbed the Iceman, was becoming a media sensation. The public was desperate to understand how such a cold-blooded killer could live undetected for decades in a quiet suburb. Now, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, Richard gave a series of interviews to writers, documentary filmmakers, and psychiatrists, where he spoke with increasing candor about his life and career. In one of those videotaped interviews in 2001, he spoke for the first time about his work for the mafia, which the police were already aware of but didn't have enough evidence for a conviction. During the course of the interview, he confessed to the murder of an NYPD detective named Peter Calabro at the behest of the mafia. After the documentary aired, 2 detectives from the state attorney general's office showed up at Trenton State Prison, wondering who ordered the hit on Calabro. Richard told them he'll talk about it as long as they promise he wouldn't get the death penalty for it. They agreed. He told them about how he was hired to kill Detective Calabro by Sammy the Bull Gravano, a Gambino family underboss. In his defense, he swore he didn't know Calabro was a cop until after the fact, but admitted that even if he did know, he probably would have done it anyway. So Richard formed an unexpected rapport with the two detectives and decided to help them out by confessing to 12 other murders he committed over the years, including Robert Prongay. The details were cross-checked in the New Jersey police were finally able to close the books on a dozen long unsolved cases. In 2003, Richard officially pled guilty to the murder of Peter Calabro. As the detectives promised, the charge added just another 30 years onto his two existing life sentences. But even though the detective held up their bargain, Richard still may have earned himself a death sentence. After Richard's guilty plea, Sammy Gravano was arrested for his role in Calabro's murder, with the trial set for the summer of 2006. Richard was supposed to be the key witness, but he wouldn't make it to court. In October 2005, Richard's health began to fail. His blood pressure dropped. He developed memory loss, dementia, slurred speech, and his lungs and kidneys began to fail. Doctors could find no explanation, no signs of a stroke or cancer. They eventually gave him the odd diagnosis of Kawasaki disease, a condition that usually affects children. Richard told his family he was afraid he was being poisoned, and if he didn't make it out of the prison hospital, it was because he was murdered. His family and doctors dismissed this as delusional, but some disclosed sources told author Anthony Bruno, who wrote a biography on Richard, that Sammy Gravano had put a contract to have him killed before he could testify in the Calabro case. The last time Barbara visited Richard at St. Vincent's Hospital, he told her, "He's such a good person. He was always such a," and she left the room without responding. On her way out the hospital, she signed to do not resuscitate order. Days later, Richard's health took a turn for the worse. The hospital called Barbara to ask if she wanted to rescind the order. She said no. Richard Kuklinski died on March the 5th, 2006, at the age of 7. The autopsy revealed traces of cadmium, a toxic substance that can cause lung and kidney failure. Regardless, the forensic examiner concluded that he died of natural causes. The day after Richard's death, the charges against Sammy Gravano for commissioning the murder of Detective Peter Calabro was dropped. Yeah, you gotta forgive me about my dog barking in the back. When Richard Kuklinski was asked how many people he killed over his nearly 4-decade career, he put the number at definitely over 100, possibly as high as 250. But at the end of his death, only 19 of those murders have been definitely linked to him, and he had only been officially convicted of 6. The rest of those homicides will remain forever unsolved. Some of Richard's victims were dangerous criminals or even killers themselves, but many of them were innocent men who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. When he wasn't working on assignment, Richard's violence was utterly senseless. Perhaps the most tragic victim were the ones Richard never killed, his wife and children, who lived in constant fear of his uncontrollable temper for decades. Though Richard was ultimately the only one responsible for his abuse and crimes, we have to remember that criminals are not created in a vacuum. When asked by author Philip Carlo how he wanted to close his story, Richard said, "I was made. I didn't create myself. I never choose to be this way, to be in this place. Yeah, I for sure wish my life took another turn, that I had an education and a good job, but none of that was in the cards for me. I am what I am." Guys, this story really affected me while doing this research. And the reason why it affected me so much, because it makes you really understand that people are easily influenced while they are in their childhood. Richard Kuklinski parents failed him. His father was an alcoholic and so abusive and violent towards not only him, but his mother, that it taught him that hate was the safest feeling to always maintain in life. His mother also did not do any better because she nourished that same type of realization for Richard Kuklinski by always hitting him for no reason and belittling him as well. Richard Kuklinski did not have a chance. Now, here's another strange fact about Richard Kuklinski that people don't understand. His little brother Joe is currently serving, I think, a life sentence for kidnapping and molesting a little 12-year-old girl. That was back in the 70s, and he's still in jail. I think he got 50 plus years. His sister lived a quiet life and passed away. Now, I looked up his family today. His ex-wife is still alive. His daughter is still alive. I could not see anything on his older children. I don't know if they still alive or not. I don't know if they changed their name, but I'm quite sure that if they did keep the last name Kuklinski, that people know who they are. But guys, thank you for listening to the Iceman. I will definitely put out more content on my paid subscriptions. I'm going to try to work on that this evening. Please join my Patreon or my paid subscription on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, guys. This is where all of the content I have that I have not published in the public for you to enjoy, where we talk about everything, to notorious gangsters, to criminals, crime family, everything you can think of. I mean, we talk about it all. With that being said, thank y'all for joining in and listening to another episode of You Can't Make This BS Up. With that being said, please, if you like this or any of my content, please leave a comment. It helps with the algorithm so people can definitely see our stuff more. And please give us a 5-star rating because it's definitely make us more visible out there. Until next time, y'all know what it is. I am out.